Hey guys, welcome to the Alt-Shift-X Patron-only live stream for this month. We're going to be talking about the upcoming House Dane video. All the mysteries of everyone's favorite fantastical, mysterious, magical, noble family of Starfall. So this video's interesting because whenever we do like a minor topic, like a topic in Game of Thrones that doesn't have all that much information about it, that isn't all that central to the main story, I often assume that like, oh, this will be a really straightforward video then. Like there won't be all that much to say when there's so little information. But I think George Martin's really good at painting broad pictures with very few words. And all of the spaces between the words are just room for us to speculate more. There are all sorts of crazy theories about House Dane, and that means there's a lot to cover. And there's also a lot of like ambiguity, and there's a lot of room for speculation, and there's a lot of mystery with everything from like the Tower of Joy to like Ashara Dane's alleged secret identities to the role of Darkstar and the role of Edric Dane and the Sword Dawn itself. And some other stuff I enjoy talking about in this video is some of the early inspirations behind House Dane. So there's like a comic book influence, there's like a Arthurian medieval fantasy literature influence. So a lot of like George Martin's favorite stuff growing up sort of made its way into House Dane, and that's really fun to talk about as well. And I think possibly because of the influence of having just done a big Watchmen video, I can't help but see some sort of parallels to the fall of House Dane, and or at least the deaths of Arthur and Ashara Dane. A parallel between that and some of the ideas in Watchmen about like a sort of idealized, simpler, nostalgic, heroic time being somehow corrupted or defaced or brought into a more complicated, darker reality. I think that's part of the story of House Dane. So that's something we talk about here as well. So what I'll do is just sort of go through what we've got in this video at the moment, and I'll focus on stuff that we might not include in full detail in the video. So because there are always bits and pieces, there are always details that don't quite make it. So I think that's interesting to hear here. And any questions and stuff that you'll have, I'll be happy to chat about. But otherwise, I'll just talk about what's going on with House Dane. And as it turns out, an awful lot is going on with House Dane. So the introduction will be simple because I want this to be accessible to people who don't know who House Dane is, as well as to the tragics who know everything from Ashara Dane's eye color to Gerald Dane's favorite beverage of choice, which is, by the way, unsweetened lemon water for those who are keeping score at home. And so we introduce House Dane by just saying, hey, noble houses, you know what those are. House Stark, House Lannister, House Targaryen. Well, here's another one for you. House Dane. We're starting real simple, guys. That's the point of Alt-Shift-X, is to start real simple. And we talk about how House Dane is super mysterious, and we just briefly give like a one-line sort of tease describing each of the main characters that we'll be talking about. Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, who was one of King Aerys's Kingsguard, who was the greatest knight ever, who just mysteriously died at the Tower of Joy. And then there's Ashara Dane, this amazing, beautiful woman who we kind of know nothing about, who might have hooked up with Ned Stark and then mysteriously committed suicide. And then Darkstar, Gerald Dane, we describe as an edgy anime villain who may play a critical role in the end of Game of Thrones. Because one of the ideas that we talk about that I think has a lot of weight to it, I think may actually be the case, is this idea that originally young Edric Dane Edric Dane being this kiddo here who Arya meets in book 3. Edric Dane might originally have been planned to age up and grow up into being the new Sword of the Morning. Because if you're aware, George R. Martin was originally planning to have a 5-year gap between book 3 and book 4. So he would have returned to Bran after Bran had spent 5 years training with Bloodraven, and he would have returned to Arya after Arya spent 5 years training with the Faceless Men, and Cersei would have spent 5 years as Queen Regent or whatever, and that gap would have changed a lot, obviously, and characters like Edric Dane, who's only 12 years old at the moment, would have been 17 years old, and he would have been of the right age to become a warrior and to take up his family sword Dawn, and to potentially play a big role in the War for the Dawn and all of that stuff. But since George Martin eventually had to scrap the 5-year gap, Edric Dane remains 5 years younger. He remains 12 years old. So it seems unlikely that he's going to be running around with a legendary sword anytime soon. But curiously, in book 4, the book after George scrapped the 5-year gap, we're introduced to a different Dane character, a new Dane character by the name of Darkstar, Gerald Dane. And he is a warrior, and he is of the right age, and maybe, fans think, he will be the one to take up the Dane family sword, Dawn. Of course, Darkstar might not gain it by legitimate means, because unlike the good boy Edric Dane, Darkstar is a #bad boy, who is jealous of the reputation of his cousin Arthur, and who is just generally a negative, spooky, edgy, dark dude. So some fans think that he'll steal the sword Dane illegitimately and run off with it, which I think would be perfectly in keeping with what little we know of his personality. But the point, whether it's by Edric or by Darkstar, the point of their role, I think, insofar as the endgame, is to bring the sword Dawn into play. And I don't think we'll have either Edric Dane or Darkstar, defeating the White Walkers with Dawn. I think that them having Dawn will somehow convey the sword Dawn to Jon, probably, or some other great warrior who will be the one to use Dawn as the legendary Lightbringer in the War for the Dawn against the White Walkers. Because, spoilers, the War for the Dawn, the legendary war against the White Walkers 8,000 years ago, it's possible that that ancient War for the Dawn included the sword Dawn, that mysterious ancient unique sword called Dawn. Are they trying to tell us something with this use of the word Dawn? I think they might be. So we also talk about the possibility that Dawn, the sword Dawn, was the original Lightbringer that was used in the first long night against the White Walkers. I think that's a very, very good theory. And we'll speculate a bit about what that sort of means in practice, because we'll talk a bit about like the Great Empire of the Dawn and the figure of the original Azor Ahai, because there are some really cool theories about House Dane possibly being the descendants of some kind of Far East civilization, either the Great Empire of the Dawn or like whoever Azor Ahai was. People think that House Dane might be descended from him, and the reasons for believing this are admittedly tenuous. Like there's this sort of factoid, there's this claim that people keep spreading around the internet, this idea that George R.R. Martin said that House Dane is not descended from the Valyrians. And to backtrack, the reason why people think that the Danes are descended from the Valyrians is that they have Valyrian features. Edric Dane has eyes that are, quote, blue, almost purple, and he has this ash blonde hair, and Gerald Dane has this ash blonde hair with his edgy black streak. Ashara Dane had her haunting violet eyes. Arthur Dane, we know literally nothing about his appearance. But it seems as though many or most of the Danes that we know have close to or near identical Valyrian features, the purple eyes. Barristan Selmy specifically says that Ashara Dane's eyes remind him of Daenerys' eyes. So it would be a reasonable guess that that House Dane was descended from Valyrian people, just like House Valerion is. Um, but that doesn't make sense because we know that House Dane is an ancient First Men family. House Dane was in Westeros thousands and thousands of years before the Valyrians and the Targaryens came to Westeros after the Doom of Valyria. So that seems like this really curious anachronism. Like, what are these Valyrian featured people doing in ancient Westeros before the Valyrians ever arrived? And George R. R. Martin made this comment where he said that, like someone asked him, why do the Danes have Valyrian features? Are they descended from the Valyrians? And George Martin gave this sort of ambiguous, rambling answer where he said that, well, not everyone who has violet eyes is necessarily a Valyrian. And he names some like real world actress who has violet eyes, and he's pretty sure that she doesn't descend from the Valyrian dragon riders. And his point is that not everyone with, a certain hair color or a certain color eyes is necessarily from a certain family, which is, a legit and important thing for him to say, I think, because, as much as the seed is strong and as much as Westeros is this wacky world where genetics is such that, like, different noble families have these distinct looks, which I don't think is a thing in real life, right? But the point is that as much as, like, it is a thing for, like, Westerosi families to have distinct genetic looks, we can't necessarily assume that the Danes are anything in particular just because of their appearance. But if we choose to guess that might be the case anyway, you can make some really interesting speculations. Because, like, if we guess that these strange Valyrian features might come from the far east here, which is not Valyria, but it is a different place with a different appearance, associated with dragon riders. What some people think is that Valyria and the Danes share a common ancestor in the Great Empire of the Dawn, possibly Azor Ahai. Because the Great Empire of the Dawn, which is it's associated with Yi Ti, and it's like this ancient, mysterious civilization, there are hints that this Great Empire had dragon riders, and that they built the Five Forts, which is this mysterious black stone-fused fortress at the edge of the world, that is mysteriously similar to the Wall, and seems to be associated with this whole story, very similar to the White Walkers and the Long Night that happened in Westeros. So what I'm trying to say is that it's possible that all the Long Night stuff, when it happened around Yi Ti, when the Five Forts were raised, and Azor Ahai defeated the White Walkers here, perhaps Azor Ahai and, some of his people, some of his descendants, traveled over to Westeros and played the role of the last hero and fulfilled the Long Night mythology in Westeros, and created all the legends that exist there. And then some of Azor Ahai's ancestors became House Dane, and they kept the sword Lightbringer, which we know was the sword Dawn. And, maybe House Dane, mythically, legendarily, plays this role of safeguarding the sword Dawn, waiting for the Long Night to come again, and they'll be ready for it. I think all of that is, like, pretty legit. Because there's just so much about House Dane that just feels magical and mythic and legendary. And, like, what else is the role of Dawn, this incredible magic sword? And what else is the significance of their unusual appearance? And what else does the institution of the Sword of the Morning mean, if not something that's tied to the War for the Dawn, right? So I think that's some really interesting speculation we can talk about. Which we cover in the video, but we've sort of jumped the gun because, like, a lot of this early stuff, a lot of the meat of the video is talking about the characters of Arthur and Ashara Dane, so we'll get into that. Milo Minder in the chat notes that one of the few things that we do know about Darkstar is that he slashes Myrcella Baratheon's face, because Darkstar is involved in Ariane Martell's plot to try and start a war, to try and empower Ariane Martell, and the original plan is to crown Myrcella Baratheon as Queen of Westeros in order to start a division between her and the Iron Throne. But Darkstar has an alternative plan that he suggests and tries to carry out. Darkstar thinks that they'd be better off murdering Marcella Baratheon. Okay, we've got a stream issue. Okay, I'll have to wait for a moment because we've got a technical issue. We should be back shortly. Okay. Sorry, the quality of the video might not be great. I think we've got like a connection issue, which is very frustrating, but we'll just have to carry on. I'll record the stream so we can always upload it afterwards if it doesn't stream nicely. Okay. So yeah, so Darkstar is a whole other thing. Oh, and yeah, this is one of the other things that is really fun to talk about some of the influences behind Arthur Dayne. But I think we'll get to that. I think we'll go more sort of sequentially through the script so far, and we can chat about Arthur and Ashara Dayne. Let's do that. So, the start of the video introduces House Dayne, and then we talk briefly about like sort of the mythology of Starfall and the origins of House Dayne, just to give people a sense of the feel and the tone, the mythic stuff behind this family. So that's over here. So we talk about how the Danes live in Dorne on the island of Starfall, and it is really unfortunate linguistically that the Danes live in Dorne, because the Danes have a sword called Dorne, and they live in a place called Dawn. And maybe it's my accent, but Dawn and Dawn sound almost indistinguishable, so it's just confusing and awkward when I say, the Danes have an ancient magic sword called Dawn, and the Danes live in Dawn. That's just, I'd like to avoid that. I might like restructure some of those sentences to try and find a way to not have to say Dawn and Dawn. Anyway, so we introduce the mythology of Starfall, and we talk about how, according to legend, thousands of years ago, the first Dane followed a falling star to the island, and there he found a stone with magical powers, the heart of the fallen star, and from that stone was forged Dawn, a strange and wondrous greatsword. Dawn is incredibly sharp and light, but it doesn't look like Valyrian steel. It's pale as milk glass and alive with light. And then we talk about the Sword of the Morning, who's the most worthy knight of House Dayne, chosen to bear the sword Dawn. And we talk about how Dawn is unusual in that, unlike other family swords, it's not just passed from father to son, it's only given to someone who can prove themselves. So you're not going to end up with some tossbag with a Valyrian steel he doesn't know how to use. All of the Swords of the Morning are like these famous badasses, so they're all legendary, and most legendary of all is Arthur Dayne. And like, side note is that this whole story of a fallen star and a stone coming from the sky and a sword being made from it is super evocative of a lot of other like mythology, like the story of the Bloodstone Emperor in Yi Ti. So he was in the Great Empire of the Dawn, and I'll pull up some lovely artwork of him. This artwork by Mandy Fink, I think, is great. The Bloodstone Emperor is someone who caused the Long Night, according to legend. And the way he caused it was by worshipping... Well, he murdered his sister in a story that is suspiciously similar to the story of Azor Ahai killing his wife Nissa Nissa. But after killing his sister, he started worshipping a black stone that had fallen from the sky. Actually, does it say that it fell from the sky? Let me double check that. I don't want to spread misinformation, but he worshipped a mysterious black stone. That much I know. That's important, actually. Let me pull that up. Yeah, he worshipped a black stone that had fallen from the sky. So there's a really distinct similarity in the story of the Bloodstone Emperor and the story of House Dane, which I think is another reason to believe that there might be some kind of ancient story where House Dane is descended from Azor Ahai. And of course, there's also this idea that, hey, maybe Azor Ahai was not such a good guy. Maybe Azor Ahai, who murdered his wife to get a flaming sword, maybe he was a baddie. And indeed, maybe Azor Ahai caused the long night before ending it, or maybe his ancestors ended it. Maybe the Bloodstone Emperor caused the long night, and then one of the Bloodstone Emperor's ancestors, or descendants rather, Azor Ahai, was the person who ended it, using a stone drawn from the sword. But one of the other reasons that this Starfall mythology is interesting is that it's pretty much ripped off from an 80s superhero. So the character of Arthur Dane seems to be heavily inspired by King Arthur of legend and folklore, and the 60s superhero Dane Whitman. King Arthur, Dane Whitman, Arthur Dane, yeah? So King Arthur, of course, was this knight who was just legendarily chivalrous and noble and skilled and super great guy, which is, just like what we know of Arthur Dane. And King Arthur even specifically draws a sword from a stone. He gets a magical special sword from a stone, just like Arthur Dane, or at least the Dane family, got their magic sword Dawn forged from a stone, from a fallen star. And also, this 60s superhero called the Black Knight, aka Dane Whitman, he got a super special magic sword from a fallen star. The ebony blade, which wise Merlin once fashioned from a star which fell from the secret shrouded heavens. That's the same shit as Dawn and Starfall, right? And fascinatingly enough, The Black Knight, this issue of this comic book, came out in 1968. And it was in the 60s that our favorite George R.R. Martin, he got his first ever published writing. And the place where George Martin's writing was published for the first time was in a 60s comic book. He's praising the Fantastic Four, and he gets a reply from Stan Lee back in the days when they published fan mail and fan letters in comic books. So George Martin's first appearance in print was this fan letter, where he sung the praises of Stan Lee and the Fantastic Four. And it's just a few years before the publication of this comic book with Dane Whitman. So I think it's beyond doubt that George Martin must have read this comic back in the 60s or back in the day, and it must have stuck in his head, because he's been talking about stones falling from the sky and fallen stars and special swords ever since. So I think these combined are sort of the influences behind Arthur Dane specifically, and I think the Danes more generally. They represent these sort of chivalric, heroic ideals, and they also represent this more sort of magical, mysterious side, which we talk about further. So, but I think that's just really cool, getting to tie it to those two different influences. And yeah, of course, like more generally, there's just sort of the Arthurian medieval storytelling, which I think Arthur Dane is sort of embodying. The whole sort of knightly virtues and chivalry is what he's all about. And I just love getting to use these sorts of old paintings to illustrate that. Like, this is just such gorgeous artwork. And I think it really captures what Arthur Dane is about. So we introduce Arthur Dane, and we talk about how Arthur Dane was a member of King Aerys's Kingsguard, said to be its deadliest warrior. This shot here is nice. It's artwork that you might not have seen before, because it's an extreme close-up of this image, which appears in the World of Ice and Fire world book, which fortunately enough, Random House was the publishing company. Random House was nice enough to provide in like super high resolution for us, so we can zoom in and we can see some of the details of this piece. So you can actually pick out all these people and their exact reactions during the tourney of Harrenhal at the exact moment that Prince Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Stark his Queen of Love and Beauty, the moment when all the smiles died, as it's described. So I think we had another connection dropout. I'm really sorry about this technical problem. There's not a whole lot we can do about it right now, but we will upload a recording if there's a problem with the stream video once it's up. So we're just talking about this lovely artwork of the tourney of Harrenhal and the moment when the smiles died, when Rhaegar crowned Lyanna as his Queen of Love and Beauty. And it's a really cool piece because you can zoom in and you can see all these people and how they react. So that there is Ashara Dane. That is the only official published artwork of Ashara Dane in any like actual Game of Thrones publication. So that's really cool to see, Ashara Dane, and that's Elia Martell, Princess Elia Martell. That's apparently Oberyn Martell, which doesn't really look at all like Oberyn Martell as I imagine him, but that's Oberyn Martell, apparently. That is Brandon Stark, according to the artist. That is Lyanna Stark, and I like how she's wearing sort of like somewhat rough clothing. She's the wild wolf after all. And that is Brandon Stark. That is Robert Baratheon, who I feel like should probably look a bit more handsome and gallant based on like Cersei's descriptions of young Robert. And then these people at the back have sort of weird identities. Let me pull them up actually, because it's kind of weird, the artist's description of those characters. Fortunately, the artist published a little guide saying who each of these characters are. So yeah, according to the artist of this piece, apparently that is Jon Connington, that is Prince Lewin Martell, that is Old Lord Hunter, and that is Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn looks right to me, but how is that Jon Connington? Jon Connington should be younger, and Jon Connington should have hair. No? He should have red hair. Why is he bald? So I don't know about these guys, but we also get up here, we have King Aerys Targaryen and his Kingsguard, and this just looked like a really gorgeous shot for me to use to illustrate King Arthur with, Sir Arthur with King Aerys. I really like this shot. There's a lot of thought, obviously, that goes into the visuals with Alt Shift X. Oh, and this painting is so nice. This is by Bella Bergholtz. She has this amazing character portraits. This one's of Sir Arthur. I've also got this other one of Ashara, which I think is also just beautiful. So I'm really happy that Bella allowed us to use this artwork. So anyway, Arthur Dane was on the Kingsguard of King Aerys Targaryen, said to be its deadliest warrior, but he was also famous for his chivalry, his sense of duty and honor. And we tell the story of Arthur defeating the Kingswood Brotherhood, which were like these outlaws back in the day. And one of the parts of that story is that instead of just going in and killing the outlaws, he first won over the local common people. Because part of the reason why these outlaws were so successful is that they were helping the common people, and the common people liked them and supported them. So Arthur won them over to the throne side instead by paying them for their food and by giving them special privileges and like bringing their grievances to the king, and just being like a very sort of progressive stand-up sort of a guy. And then he killed the Smiling Knight like a badass. And Arthur Dane was also a successful tournament knight, and he was doing jousting and stuff. And he just seemed to be this super successful, well-loved dude. And everyone admires him. Ned Stark says that Arthur was the finest knight he ever saw, which is curious given that Ned Stark ended up killing Arthur, or Howland and Ned killed Arthur. Ned Stark later calls Arthur splendid, the splendid Arthur Dane, which is just so curious given that he killed Arthur. and Arthur was apparently trying to stop Ned from getting to Lyanna Stark. Like, why would Ned be thinking so positively of Arthur Dayne if Arthur Dayne was so much of an obstacle to Ned that Ned had to kill him? I think that the conclusion we have to draw is that Ned respects Arthur's reasons. So I think Arthur Dayne is defined by his sense of duty and his loyalty and his honor, and I think those are values that Ned understands. So I think like the most sort of likely explanation is basically that, Arthur was just doing his job. He was just doing what he was ordered to do. Arthur was presumably ordered to not let anyone into the Tower of Joy until Rhaegar got back. And so that's why Arthur felt honor bound to stop Ned from entering the Tower of Joy, and that's why they fought. I think that's like the simplest answer as to what was going on at the Tower of Joy between Arthur and Ned. But we do consider some alternatives as well. Some people also point out that Arthur Dayne, like, for someone who everyone agrees was like this superlative badass crazy super mega warrior, he doesn't actually have like a lot of accomplishments to his name. Like, it's kind of reminiscent of like Jaime Lannister having like a rather short page on the White Book. Arthur Dayne also has a pretty short page. Like, the Kingswood Brotherhood is kind of like the only concrete accomplishment we have of his that we know about. You'd think that someone so legendary would have accomplished more. But we'll talk about that a bit more shortly. So basically, Arthur Dayne was idolized by everybody, and we then talk about, the inspirations, the superhero Dane Whitman, and George R. R. Martin's adorable fan letter when he was a teenager. And basically what we draw from that is that Arthur Dayne embodies like the perfect fantasy hero. Like, he's a combination of like a superhero and like the legendary King Arthur. He's an honorable, powerful, skilled warrior who fights bad guys and doesn't afraid of anything. He's the ultimate hero, and so I think it's really, really significant and really, really interesting that this legendary archetypical hero dies 15 years before the story begins. Arthur Dayne is the ultimate hero, but he's not the hero of this story. So that's part of the point of Game of Thrones, right? Is to question and subvert and to undermine those sorts of traditional assumptions about heroes and about good and evil. And I think by killing Arthur Dayne, Game of Thrones is symbolically killing so many of our like assumptions and our preconceptions about this kind of storytelling, and I connect it to the bloody smiley symbol in Watchmen and the comic book Watchmen, which is all about killing the simplistic idea of the superhero. I think the story of Arthur Dayne is something similar. Although I do think that Arthur Dayne was probably involved in like political and like prophetic conspiracies with his friend Rhaegar, which we will get to. But symbolically, at least, I think that's what Arthur's about. It's the fall of like the perfect chivalric fantasy hero. And Ashara is similar. I think Ashara Dayne represents sort of like an idealized female role. In the sense that like Arthur embodies like a male hero archetype, and Ashara embodies a beautiful female maiden in a tower sort of an archetype, with all of the baggage that carries. So all that we really know about Ashara was that she was a beautiful young woman with haunting violet eyes. And she went to King's Landing, she joined court as a companion to Princess Elia, and she was at the tourney of Harrenhal, and she danced with a few people, and that's kind of all that we know about her. We don't know her personality, we don't know her motivations, we don't know any of her lines, we don't know any of her thoughts. But she is remembered so fondly by so many people. So, especially at the tourney of Harrenhal. So, we describe the tourney of Harrenhal again as like just the best party in Westeros ever. Everyone was there. and everyone wanted to hook up with Ashara. She danced with Oberyn Martell and with Jon Connington, and she danced with Ned Stark, but only after Ned's brother Brandon asked Ashara for the dance because Ned was shy. And there's a rumor that Ashara Dane and Ned Stark fell in love and had sex that night, and some characters believe that Ashara is Jon Snow's mother. So we get this information from like a confused scattering of sources. So like Catelyn Stark thinks about this rumor that she heard in Winterfell about Ashara Dane possibly being the mother of Jon Snow. And we also hear from Ashara's nephew, Ned Dane, Edric Dane, who's called Ned, which is a whole other sort of confusing tangent. The fact that Ned Dane seems to be named after Ned Stark, the man who murdered Arthur Dane. I'll just type in the chat real quickly that we've got connection problems just in case anyone's confused. So sorry about the dropouts. Will upload complete video if this stream doesn't work. We will have a different technical setup by next month, I think, so we should avoid these very frustrating connection dropouts. All right, so Ashara Dane at the tourney of Harrenhal, great party, and all these different rumors that Ashara and Ned might have hooked up there. Cersei Lannister is one of the people who suggests that Ashara Dane might be Cersei's, that Ashara Dane might be Jon Snow's mother. Harwin of House Stark also has heard these rumors about Ashara and Ned. There's all this talk of something having gone on there. And we note that Ashara, according to Barristan Selmy, had a stillborn daughter and soon after committed suicide. Because only like a couple of years after the tourney of Harrenhal, after Robert's Rebellion, Ashara died. She threw herself from a tower at Starfall. And we don't know exactly why. There's different characters say different things about why Ashara killed herself. Some people say that Ashara killed herself out of grief for her murdered brother Arthur, or her slain brother Arthur. Some people say that it's more about this stillborn child that she apparently had. And we can also look at some of other reasons Ashara might have been upset, like the horrific murder and rape of Princess Elia, who was Ashara's companion. And again, we don't know anything about what the relationship between Elia and Ashara was. Like, maybe they were best friends. Maybe they hated each other. We have no idea, but it's got to be an upsetting thing for Elia to have been murdered so horribly, no matter what their relationship was. Brandon Stark was also killed recently, and we'll get to that as well. But the point is that Ashara had a lot of reasons to be upset. But the mystery remains of what exactly was the relationship between Ned Stark and Ashara. And there are a lot of people who think that it might have actually been Brandon's brother, Ned's brother Brandon, and not Ned, who hooked up with Ashara. Because, like, when you think about Ned's personality, is he the sort of person who would treat Ashara like this? Would he have hooked up with her at the tourney of Harrenhal? He must have continued their relationship and like later had sex at least once later on, because Ashara must have gotten pregnant later so that she could have that stillborn child later. So like there must have been some kind of ongoing relationship between Ashara and this mystery Stark, because Barristan Selmy suggests that it was a Stark who quote unquote dishonored Ashara. But Ned is like this super honorable guy. Would he have had this relationship with this unmarried noblewoman and then presumably like rejected Ashara to go and marry Catelyn when Ned went to Starfall and saw Ashara at Starfall after killing Arthur? He must have like rejected her there and then gone off to marry Catelyn, gone and rode north. And that must have been what broke Ashara's heart, if Ned was the one who hooked up with her. which just doesn't seem at all like Ned's personality. He's honorable, he's shy, he's not like bloody Jamie Lannister, who totally screwed over Brienne, right? In season 8. But it just doesn't seem right for Ned Stark to act like that. It doesn't seem in keeping with the sort of person who he is. Also, like, Ned Stark literally doesn't think about or mention Ashara a single time in the entire series. So if they had some kind of, like, tragic relationship or some kind of something that ended badly, like, surely Ned would have thought about her at least once. If a woman killed herself over him, surely he would have thought about her. And also, importantly, if it was Ned who hooked up with Ashara, Barristan Selmy wouldn't like Ned so much. Because, we get a lot of this information about the Stark who dishonored Ashara from Barristan. Because Barristan loved Ashara, and Barristan had this whole thing of remembering Ashara. So, if it was Ned Stark who hooked up with Ashara, surely Barristan wouldn't like Ned so much. Given how protective he was of Ashara. So all of this to say that I think that it makes a lot more sense for Barristan, for Brandon Stark to be the Stark who hooked up with Ashara, because unlike Ned, Brandon actually had a reputation as someone who liked to sleep around. I think we'll use the term fuckboy in the video because that'll be funny. And he, quote, was never shy about taking what he wanted. That's what Barbary Dustin said, who also had a sexual relationship with Brandon. Brandon was older than Ned, more handsome, more impulsive. He was the one who, had to, introduce Ned to Ashara and ask for the dance. I think it's easy to see how Brandon might be a more attractive option for Ashara than Ned. And also, it sort of recontextualizes Ashara's later suicide. Because if it was that Ashara committed suicide over the Stark who dishonored her, if it's Ned, it must have been just like a rejection thing. But with Brandon was killed in Robert's Rebellion, at the start of Robert's Rebellion. Brandon Stark was killed by King Aerys. And so it might not have been rejection that made Ashara aggrieved. It might have been the death of her lover, the fucked up death, murdered by her king. And in fact, depending on how you read Barristan Selmy's thoughts, I think that actually might be straight up what the text is suggesting. I think that the fandom might be more confused about this than they should need to be. Let me pull that up. So the line goes that Barristan Selmy thinks that Ashara Dane's daughter had been stillborn, and his fair lady Ashara had thrown herself from a tower soon after, mad with grief for the child she had lost, and perhaps for the man who had dishonored her at Harrenhal. So, some people read this as saying that maybe Ashara was feeling grief over the child that she lost, and feeling grief for the man who had dishonored her at Harrenhal. Depending on how you read that, grammatically, I think that suggests that she felt grief for the man who had dishonored her, which suggests that the man who had dishonored her died, right? So that suggests that it's Brandon and not Ned, because Brandon at this point was dead and Ned Stark was not. This line doesn't really make sense if Ned Stark was the one who had sex with Ashara, because how could she feel grief for a man who was still living? And maybe it's just grief in terms of being rejected by him, I guess. But I don't think that's how this sentence is meant to be read. I think this sentence is actually a fairly straightforward indication that it was Brandon and not Ned. But I mean, that's kind of because you can read that differently. You don't have to interpret that line in that way. So I think it is kind of subjective. So I think that's why it's also important to talk about the differences in personality between Brandon and Ned, etc., etc. Either way, it's a very different story, I think, if we consider that Brandon Stark and Ashara Dane might have had some sort of ongoing relationship. And it would have to be some kind of ongoing relationship if Brandon hooked up at the tourney of Harrenhal and also fathered the stillborn daughter, because that was years after the tourney of Harrenhal. So it must have been an ongoing thing. And the fact that Brandon, Ashara's secret lover, presumably, was murdered, along with the death of Arthur and the loss of the child and Elia's death and all the other horrors of Robert's Rebellion. I think all of that adds up to be the heartbreak and the grief that led Ashara to suicide. I think that's a story that makes sense. So all that speculation aside, it would be really nice to know like what Ashara's thoughts and feelings were herself, but the books don't tell us anything about her personality. We only know her from distant memories. She's not really a character so much as an idealized romantic symbol in the minds of the people who knew her. A nostalgic memory of when Barristan and Ned and their friends were young and alive and full of hope. And I think Arthur Dayne is similar. When Jaime remembers Arthur, he thinks the world was simpler in those days, and men as well as swords were made of finer steel. So Arthur and Ashara both represent this sort of idealized past, a bygone time when knights were honorable and women were beautiful, and there weren't so many fucking White Walkers everywhere. It's the good old days, which, you know, didn't necessarily ever exist. Like, the good old days weren't necessarily all that good, because, of course, you know, Mad King Aerys was in charge back in those days. You know, the good old days weren't actually that good, but the characters who remember it fondly because, you know, of their youth and their nostalgia. And I think those feelings are what Arthur and Ashara represent in a lot of ways. And I think they also represent a lot of nostalgia for George Martin, because, you know, Arthur Dayne is a combination of these superhero comics that George read growing up, and the Arthurian medieval legends, all this nostalgic literature that George was reading as a teenager, is embodied by these characters. So both within the world and outside of the fiction, the Danes embody a sort of idealized romantic past. And when Arthur dies and Ashara die before the story even starts, I think that symbolizes the death of the romantic past and the birth of a darker, more complicated reality. But a falling star can mean death, but it can also mean rebirth and change, like the bleeding star at the start of Book 2. And the legacy of House Dayne may play a key role in the War for the Dawn and the ending of Game of Thrones. And this, I think, is significant for, like, the fundamental meaning of Game of Thrones. Like, a lot of people think that Game of Thrones is just relentlessly cynical, and it's nihilistic, and it's just violence, and there's no hope, and the good guys all die. But I don't think that's how it's going to feel in the end. I think that Game of Thrones, as much as it is, like, challenging the assumptions of, like, fantasy and all the idealizing and all the romanticism, I think Game of Thrones also fundamentally still has some belief in heroism and fantasy and knighthood and virtue and goodness and hope and so on. And I think that has to play out in the end in some way. And I think that will correspond to House Dayne playing a role. So I think that'll be embodied by Edric Dayne, possibly, or at the very least by the Sword Dawn playing a role in the War for the Dawn. Man, the internet's just dropping out constantly, which is really annoying. I wish that didn't happen, but we'll upload the full video later. So we're going to talk about all that stuff that I sort of covered before about how Dawn might be involved in the War for the Dawn, but we also got to address some of those, like, thorny, ambiguous mysteries surrounding the Tower of Joy. Because at the end of the day, as much as Arthur and Ashara represent and symbolized a sort of, like, simple, idealistic, romantic past, I think they were also involved in the events of the Tower of Joy in a complicated, messy way. Something more messy than we normally think that Arthur and Ashara were as people. So it seems as though Arthur was just, like, loyal, and he was just duty-bound, and he was just doing his job as a Kingsguard knight. But like Jaime Lannister, Arthur must have stood and watched while Aerys burned innocent people alive. Like, Arthur would not have been blind to the evils and the excesses of King Aerys's reign. And it seems plausible that Arthur was involved in the political jostling against King Ares, because we're told that, at this time, there was this great political division. There was this factionalism between the people who supported King Ares Targaryen and the people who supported Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. There's this line in The World of Ice and Fire where it describes like the two sides to this division. It's compared to what court was like before the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen Civil War. This was an incredibly delicate, tenuous situation politically. And so The World of Ice and Fire lists the people who supported King Aerys, and it lists the people who supported Rhaegar instead, and the text says that most formidable of all Rhaegar's friends and allies in King's Landing was surely Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. And this is in the context specifically of this very political division. So I think that sort of implies that Arthur had a lot of political significance. He wasn't just like an apolitical Kingsguard. He was one of the closest confidants of Prince Rhaegar. We're told that Arthur Dayne was Rhaegar's oldest friend and someone who he trusted deeply. To the extent that Prince Rhaegar was involved in political plots against King Aerys, I think Arthur Dayne was involved, or at the very least aware. And there are lots of hints that Prince Rhaegar was plotting against King Aerys. In fact, the tourney of Harrenhal is rumored to have been basically a cover for a political move against King Aerys. An informal Great Council was what Rhaegar is alleged to have planned with the tourney of Harrenhal. And, we've got that line that, like, Rhaegar said to Jaime Lannister in memory, saying that when I come back from the Battle of the Trident, I'm going to call a council, changes must be made. Which all but confirms that Rhaegar absolutely was planning to remove his mad father and make himself king. Spoiler, didn't work out that way, but Rhaegar was plotting politically, and therefore I think Arthur was involved, or at least aware, because of his relationship with Rhaegar. But of course, the other aspect to Rhaegar's motivations was that he wasn't just political, he was interested in prophecy, and he was interested in magic. He was interested in the prophecy of Azor Ahai. And for a while he thought that, Rhaegar thought that he himself was the hero. Later he decided that his son Aegon would be the hero, and his is the Song of Ice and Fire. But he said there must be one more. The dragon has 3 heads, there must be one more. But, unfortunately, his wife Elia couldn't have any more children after she had Rhaenys. So Rhaegar believed that he needed another child to fulfill the prophecy of Azor Ahai, but he couldn't have it with Elia. And then at the tourney of Harrenhal, he meets this cool woman, Lyanna Stark, and they seem to fall in love at the Tower of Joy and have this whole thing. So it may be that part of the reason why Rhaegar hooked up with Lyanna was that he needed to have a child with her to fulfill his interpretation of the prophecy of Azor Ahai. And I think it's possible that Rhaegar might have lost interest in his children by Elia, Aegon, and Rhaenys, and he might have decided that his child with Lyanna, who would become Jon Snow, might be like Azor Ahai, like singularly by himself, if only because being the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark makes Jon like a symbolic child of ice and fire. Like maybe that you don't need the 3 heads of the dragon. Maybe you don't need 3 people. Maybe Jon is Azor Ahai just by himself. Or whatever. We don't know exactly what Rhaegar was thinking. But the point is that by getting with Lyanna, Rhaegar probably thought that he was fulfilling the prophecy of Azor Ahai. And that seems to have distracted him from his political concerns with King Aerys, which sort of led to Robert's Rebellion and the downfall of the Targaryens. So that was a fuck up. But he thought he was saving the world, and it seems as though Arthur was involved in this, because not only is Arthur Rhaegar's oldest, most trusted friend, but we're told in the official World of Ice and Fire app that, quote, Rhaegar abducted Lyanna with the aid of Sir Arthur Dayne, and Sir Oswell went. So Arthur was there when Rhaegar ran off with Lyanna, and surely this implies that Arthur was, a confidant, a close friend, someone who must have known what was going on with all this prophecy stuff. And Arthur and Oswell Wend and Gerald Hightower presumably stayed with Rhaegar and Lyanna at the Tower of Joy for like a year during Robert's Rebellion. Like, Rhaegar and Lyanna ran off, the war started, and Arthur and Oswell and Gerald, they didn't participate in the war. They didn't protect their king, Aerys, despite being Kingsguard. They stayed and guarded Rhaegar and Lyanna at the Tower of Joy for like a year. Again, like, presumably. We don't know for sure where they were the whole time, but like, we're specifically told that Arthur and Oswell were with Rhaegar and Lyanna at the start, and we know that the Kingsguard were at the Tower of Joy in the end, so presumably they spent the whole time at the Tower of Joy. Like, that makes sense. It's not like Rhaegar and Lyanna would have been alone in the tower for that whole year, So they must have known what was going on, is my point. So when Arthur died at the Tower of Joy, I don't think he was doing it just out of simple loyalty. Rhaegar told me to guard Lyanna here, so I'm going to guard Lyanna. He must have had some awareness of like the prophetic importance of Lyanna's child. Surely, Rhaegar must have been talking about this stuff at the Tower of Joy. And like, further, if Arthur was purely motivated by his duty as a Kingsguard, surely he would have been guarding the king during the war. Right? The Game of Thrones show makes this a bit more explicit when I think it was Arthur, one of the Kingsguard, says that our prince wanted us here. So like, the show says that Prince Rhaegar specifically ordered the Kingsguard to stay at the Tower of Joy and not do anything else. Which also means there must have been some kind of plan, right? Like, what was the long-term plan at the Tower of Joy when Arthur and the Kingsguard were guarding Lyanna? Like, they weren't going to let Ned get into the tower, but what were they going to do? They couldn't be just waiting for Rhaegar to come back, because, Rhaegar was dead by then, Aerys was dead by then. Were they planning to sail east, to, like, retreat over to the Narrow Sea to try and, like, put the heir, Jon Snow, on the throne once more at some point? Well, maybe not, because in the dialogue in the Tower of Joy dream that Eddard has, it says the Kingsguard do not flee, then or now. And they talk about how Willem Dowry is going east with Daenerys and Viserys, and Gerald Hightower's like, no, we're not doing that. We're not running east. So like, what was their plan? Were they just choosing to be killed? Were they choosing to be killed by Ned Stark? Were they choosing to die nobly, or did they have some kind of plan going on? We don't know the details. But I guess the point that we're trying to make here is that Arthur was a little bit more complicated than just a simple knight doing his duty. I think that his relationship with Rhaegar, the hints of his sort of political involvement, all this prophecy stuff, he must have been aware of some sort of broader magical context. And the very fact that he dies at the Tower of Joy instead of by King Aerys or with Rhaegar or whatever, I think it means that he knew about the prophecy stuff to at least some extent. And also, you can connect the symbolism of Arthur Dayne dying to the prophecy of Azor Ahai itself, in that Arthur dying, his sigil is a falling star, and the death of Arthur Dayne is like a bleeding star. He's a bloody star. He's a Dane. The Game of Thrones show even makes that, even gives us some visuals a bit like that when it puts the bloody sword Dawn up against the bed where Jon Snow is born. This shot here is pretty evocative, because the prophecy of Azor Ahai says that Azor Ahai will be reborn beneath a bleeding star. And what is a bleeding star if not a dead Arthur of House Dayne with the sword Dawn? So maybe in some roundabout way, Arthur Dayne's death contributes to some of the sort of prophetic imagery around the birth of Jon Snow and him being Azor Ahai. So maybe abstractly, symbolically, prophetically, Arthur's death did have some kind of meaning, and it did sort of help fulfill Rhaegar's goal of birthing Azor Ahai reborn. And so from that point, we transition into talking about how the sword Dawn might play a role in the War for the Dawn and the Long Night. And I think basically what's likely to happen is that Darkstar or maybe Edric Dane gets the sword Dawn, and one way or another the sword goes from them to Jon Snow, and the sword Dawn plays the role of the sword Lightbringer, and ultimately saves the world. Spoilers, probably by killing Daenerys with it. But ultimately, that means that the legacy of House Dane plays a role in the end game and saving the world. So the Danes fulfill their sort of mythic, legendary role in ending the War for the Dawn once again, as they probably did back in the day. I think that's basically the thesis of this video. So I hope you enjoyed that discussion. As you can tell, there's a lot of complexities and there's a lot of tangents to it, and at the moment with the script I'm sort of in the process of deciding what to include and what not to include, which is tricky, but I think we've got plenty of cool ideas to talk about here, and I think even talking through it like this was helpful in figuring out. I feel like we've got too much material about the Tower of Joy, because like all this Tower of Joy ambiguity and all these theories kind of amounts to like not a whole lot in terms of Arthur just being aware of the prophecy and the bleeding star. Although there is all this other stuff that we didn't talk about the possibility of the nursemaid Willa or Wyla, who apparently nursed a baby Jon Snow, and she's from Starfall. So like it seems pretty possible that, you know, when Rhaegar and Lyanna and Arthur Dane and the Kingsguard were at the Tower of Joy, they were going to have a baby. They didn't have a nursemaid. They didn't have a midwife. So it may be that Arthur Dane suggested, well, why don't we just go get Wyla, the nursemaid from Starfall, from his family, and Starfall's not that far away from the Tower of Joy. And maybe Ashara Dane was aware of that when she was at Starfall. And maybe the Danes basically were like a lot more involved than we realize in this prophecy business and the birth of Jon Snow. And also maybe Ashara Dane participated in figuring out like the cover story for Jon Snow. Like this whole rumor, there's also this whole other rumor about Wyla being the mother of Jon Snow. Edric Dane believes that Wyla is Jon Snow's mother. And I think it's possible that Ashara and maybe Illyria, the other Danes who were at Starfall when Ned visited after the death of Arthur, maybe they helped with this idea of let's say that Wyla is Jon Snow's mother. And some other people believe these conspiracy theories that maybe Ashara is still alive and faked her own death, maybe as some kind of weird part of this whole Jon Snow birth cover-up thing, but honestly, I'm not super compelled by any of those arguments. I mean, like, symbolically, I think the death of Ashara means something in terms of, like, you know, the death of this mythic, idealized past, but also, like, you know, people say that, oh, Ashara Dane is Scepter Lemore, but Lemore doesn't have the purple eyes, and people say, oh, Ashara Dane is Quaithe, but there are already like 15 people who seem to be Quaithe. I'm just not super compelled by those ideas, and I don't think that would add a whole lot to the story. So I don't think we'll discuss the Ashara Dane secret identity stuff too much. But I think it's certainly possible that Ashara and Arthur and the Danes were involved in Jon Snow's birth in pretty significant ways. So we'll speculate about that as well. Anyway, so that's the stream. Thank you all so much for participating. Really sorry about these connection problems. We'll fix that up for next time. We will have a recording of this online, so you'll be able to see it without the dropouts. And we'll do another stream next month. I think this video will be out pretty soon. I would have liked to have had it out already, but it got more complicated than I thought it would. Once the Dane video is done, I would like to do a His Dark Materials video, because His Dark Materials is starting in a couple of weeks, or in like 10 days or something. It's pretty soon. So I'd like to do sort of like an introductory video to the world of His Dark Materials. Watchmen is coming out very soon. We might do some kind of Watchmen thing. Next month, I think we'll do an Expanse video about the sci-fi series The Expanse, because season 4 of The Expanse is coming. And of course, we will be doing more Song of Ice and Fire content ahead. So there's lots of stuff coming. And I'm really excited. It's really fun to do a Song of Ice and Fire video again after so long. I think this will be a really good one. I'm also really happy with the visuals and the artwork that we've got. So I think this will be a really cool video. So thank you so much for supporting and participating, and we'll keep you posted and see you next time. Cheers.